So, on today's Encrypted Economy, we have Alistair Muir from Australia, the CEO of Vanteum, and they do a lot of advisory services on privacy enhancing tech and all that stuff. Now, I got introduced to these guys through the Privacy Enhancing Technology Summit in Boston. I'll drop a link in the show notes. I'm going to be doing an armchair fireside discussion at the end of the conference, I think. So, at any rate, they introduced me to Alistair Muir. He is a leader, thought leader in terms of privacy enhancing technologies. And so I think it's really exciting to see how thought leaders are approaching this outside of the US and Europe, where we do a lot of our show focuses. So this is really a window into worldwide adoption. And this is not a technical discussion by any stretch. It's really just intended to provide a different lens for understanding worldwide adoption. So what does adoption look like? What are the challenges experienced? Where is the opportunity? How are governments responding to it? And I invite you to listen to find out. So if you enjoy this, share it with others. Welcome to the Encrypted Economy, a weekly podcast featuring discussions exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel. I've spent decades representing regulated exchanges, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and all manner of fintech companies for all things touching electronic trading with a focus on new and developing technologies. So, the Encrypted Economy is excited to have Alistair Muir, CEO of Vanteum, on the podcast today. Vanteum is an advisory business for open banking and financial services located in the Down Under. So, Alistair, welcome.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking a bit about privacy enhancing technologies today and adoption in Australia and other parts of the world. But before we begin with all of that, why don't you give us a little bit about your background and how you found yourself, at Vanteum and entering into the space of privacy enhancing technologies?
Yeah, fantastic, Eric. Thank you. So I suppose my background is a kind of a strange old blend of digital product, venture, kind of that data commercialization side, but also fintech as well. So I've been a founder of a fintech, but also worked with a number of fintechs here in Australia, as well as helping some international fintechs make their market entries into this region as well. But I suppose I've been working in data sharing and open banking for quite some time. And in fact, actually been working sort of in open banking before it was regulated in Australia and New Zealand. And so I've been advising some Fortune 500 financial services companies, including banks, large general insurers, and that sort of thing, on both data sharing and data partnerships, but then also the open banking and how can a large bank, for example, put a proposition to a customer that helps them kind of grow their customer base, help them acquire new customers, but also adds value to the existing customer base as well. So I suppose the other thing, probably just in my background to sort of tease out, is that I've also worked a lot with our national science agency here, so the CSRO here in Australia, and really helped their SciTech accelerator to with the commercialization of science and technology. So really that's about helping researchers and scientists kind of have line of sight to industry and sort of solving industry problem with their research, and then helping them kind of learn the commercialization skills to then be able to, once they've identified that kind of line of sight, actually being able to sort of accelerate things and actually turn the technology into businesses and get the capital they need. So as part of that, I suppose I've worn several hats. One has been as a kind of a pro bono mentor to some of the founders in the accelerator. Also an advisor to the program to help it sort of get scale. But then also I've been an entrepreneur in residence within that program, kind of going deep with a couple of different ventures to accelerate that commercialization. So I'm sort of proud of the work that I've done there, simply because we've through that work spun out, I think, 64 new companies from kind of world-class science and technology. And I think it's one of those things, and you'll probably hear it come through later on, but it's one of those things that I'm really passionate about, which is if you can get that line of sight to industry problem and commercialize science and technology, you can have a real impact. You can have a real impact with that, with getting research out of the lab and into the market, so to speak.
Excellent. And in terms of that moment where you first realized the importance of privacy enhancing technologies. I know you and I had spoken about a particular project that you're working on where you suddenly started to realize all the different issues that arose with privacy. Do you want to expand a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Eric. I think so. So naturally, as part of working in any heavily regulated industry, and trying to put data partnerships together between, say, an insurer or a bank or an insurer and even a telco, there are kind of, I had, I suppose, lived the challenges of trying to get those data partnerships off the ground. And actually, it was broader than any single project, but the sort of challenges we encountered regularly were actually, you're in a heavily regulated environment. It's what can you do with that data? Who can you share it with, and what, for what purposes, right? That was a kind of a constant issue. And then you've got, the natural legalities around what you can and can't do with data anyway. So certainly privacy is one aspect of that. Privacy in terms of the legal part, but also privacy in terms of you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing with the data that you're the custodian of. The other part, I suppose, that became very evident to me was that in a lot of these partnerships, regardless of what sort of side you were on, there's a lot of commercial sensitivity in sort of the actual data itself. So what if the other party learns something from the data that we have that reveals something commercially sensitive about our business? So, and then another sort of big part of this is trust. So how much do we trust the other party that we're actually sharing this data with? And then to kind of overcome some of those challenges, or at least to address some of those challenges, different organizations have, different data governance requirements. And before you know it, you start then going, well, what do we then need to do to this data to minimize some of these risks? And so you essentially do stuff to the data. You mask certain fields, you remove, fields with PII in them, you use aggregation techniques to kind of minimize certain things. And then sometimes, in some cases, you use a centralized data platform to kind of remove some of the PII, and it's centralized, so therefore it's a kind of a trusted third party. But the challenge with all of that is that you as you do more and more stuff to the data, you're actually minimizing the utility or reducing that utility for the data as well. So on one side of a continuum, almost, you're addressing all of these risks, but on the other side, you're actually reducing the utility, right? And it feels like you're constantly trading off these things against each other as if they're mutually exclusive to try to get to some sort of middle ground where it's acceptable based on the risk controls of the organization. And the challenge there is that if you think that's hard enough, this all takes time and you end up killing deals, right? But then if you add to it the kind of, in these regulated industries, there's a real reluctance to kind of let data leave an organization. So if you're dealing with raw data, organizations don't allow the raw data to leave their control, their environment to go to another. You naturally got sort of information security requirements as well, and a kind of a real desire to protect the data in transit, at rest, and also in use. I kind of lived those challenges, and it was a bit of a slog, to be honest, a bit of a slog. And then that's how I kind of came to discover privacy enhancing technologies, which I think as I was doing some work with the CSRO, and one of their teams that was in the accelerator was looking at homomorphic encryption and looking at secure multi-party computation. And so I suppose having kind of realized those technologies and what you can actually do with those technologies, I kind of, how do I put it? It's to be able to do analysis on data while it remains encrypted, and also to potentially do analysis on data while it remains encrypted without ever having to move that data from any individual company's environment, really kind of opened my eyes. But I suppose having sort of seen what Data 61 were doing and looking to commercialize these technologies, having seen the possible applications of these technologies in everything from detecting illicit money flows in financial services through to, thinking back to the sort of impediments that I had been facing with almost every single data share between organizations, whether it be bilateral or multilateral. I just saw so many potential solves for those problems, right? So I got quite excited, arguably bitten by the homomorphic encryption bug, so to speak. And so really, I was asked to sort of step into this project or venture within Data 61 to help them spin it out, help them commercialize this tech. And so I've been quite active in that advocacy piece, I've been involved in the standardization efforts of homomorphic encryption. I've also been involved in the early days as the MPC Alliance. I did raise to the Australian Senate here, and it really came off the back of a what happened in Australia. There was a kind of an Australian data matching bill that was being proposed at the time, and that was really with the objective of reducing fraudulent Medicare claims. So the way the government were kind of structuring things is that Medicare is our centralized body that kind of administers healthcare and that sort of thing. There was potentially $600 million worth of fraudulent claims that they wanted to kind of get to the bottom of. And the way that they were proposing to do that was to get, the data from, I think, 6 or 7 other federal state bodies and centralize all of that data in a single place, very, very sensitive data.
No honeypot there.
Massive honeypot risk, right? And so, that whole centralization of data, the way that the whole bill was being drafted was prescribing the movement of data. It was all based on raw data. It was all going to a single place, and it's give it to us all, give us all the powers with it, and then we'll run analysis on it. And if we find fraudulent claims, then we're going to tap you on the shoulder, kind of thing. So really use that as an opportunity here in Australia, actually to collaborate with Galois Inc. So they're a US-based cybersecurity firm, great pedigree in homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party computation, and other privacy-enhancing technologies. Really uses as an opportunity to kind of showcase what else is going on in the world, right? Let's broaden the horizons here. There are lots of countries around the world and government agencies within those countries around the world that are embracing these technologies for evidence-based policy, doing things in a way that allow the richness of that analysis on data without having to actually physically move that data, without having to risk citizens' security of citizen data and also the privacy, right? So we put a lot together there, and unfortunately, it really fell on deaf ears here in Australia. We did a lot of sort of campaigning and advocacy work, and we enlisted some others. But through that campaigning work, kind of met with a few ministers and senators here in Australia, and that was kind of the background to then being asked to put some stuff to the Australian Senate as part of their fintech and regtech inquiry here on how could we use some of these technologies in a fintech, regtech, financial services setting? How could it be used almost to generate another industry, or do it from an export perspective, right? So from a technology export perspective, yeah.
And so, what happened to that Medicare bill, or I call it Medicare? What happened to the fraudulent medical claim bill?
Well, unfortunately, the bill was passed. So now it's sort of enshrined in legislation that these various agencies are forced to share that data. And we had after all of that, we still have sort of ongoing dialogue with the Federal Department of Health. Unfortunately, and I think this is the challenge, right? Really broadly speaking, a lot of these government agencies, they're trying to solve the problem in front of them, if that makes sense. They're not necessarily aware of some of these cutting edge technologies that are, maybe a step away or 2 steps away in the future from what is absolutely mainstream right now. And I really do understand it from their perspective, which is they're trying to solve an immediate problem.
The way that it's always been done, but it's probably not accounting for the fact that the amount of data is growing exponentially.
Exactly. And I think there's a real lack of awareness on what some of these technologies are going to, they're going to soon be mainstream. They're still a couple of years away before that's the case, I feel. But to not even be aware of them, and then to almost draft legislation in a way that as I say, prescribes the movement of data, prescribes the use of raw data, you're almost accidentally prescribing things in which leads to undesirable situations.
Right, the honeypot effect. And in the context of, and just to sort of remain with that example for a bit, a secure multi-party computation type of architecture might have had each of the agencies retaining their data and potentially performing computations which designed to produce a result that would be indicative of like a red flag to further investigate. Then there'd also be, even now with the data centralized, they could homomorphically encrypt it, and still gain those benefits. Of course, that would require probably a fair amount of upgrading. Like, I think it's a very interesting example, and I'd like
Mm.
to sort of explore it more because you had firsthand experience with it.
It almost flows in the way that which countries are more mature in evidence-based policy, which countries are more mature in kind of data privacy, but then beyond that, it's which agencies within which country are kind of more mature in their thinking about how do they undertake data sharing partnerships with the private sector or intergovernmental partnerships. And sometimes it comes down to the people that are in those agencies, frankly. But to give you a sense, the Australian, it certainly felt through the conversations that the Australian Federal Department of Health here were a long way off in terms of their understanding, a long way off in terms of their maturity around the issues and risks that are thrown up by raw data, by sharing data, and just it's also very clear through that example, by the way, that there were a lot of politics at play, control between agencies and that sort of thing. But there are some exemplars, I'd say, the likes of IMDA in Singapore, right? So they are Infocomm's Media Development Authority, and their kind of privacy data. I'm trying to remember the exact name of it, but their privacy. They've got a privacy and data commission, and as part of some of the work that they do, they work with the private sector. So they'll do hackathons, they'll do a variety of different things to kind of stimulate closer ties between industry and also government. And as part of that, they've got a safe data sharing framework. So they actually go out and promote ways to undertake some of these data shares for both social good, but also sort of private sector benefit. And as part of that, they explicitly call out the use of homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party computation as ways to undertake these data shares. Similarly, I mentioned the AUSTRAC example here. So that's obviously an agency that sees the benefit. And I mean, it's a $3 trillion problem globally, right, around anti-money laundering and illicit money flow. So definitely the carrot's there. But then you can also look at their counterparties in the UK, for example. So the FCA are also pretty active in both the promotion of privacy enhancing technologies, but also then trying to understand more and more about that and what the applicability is in FS, financial services, sorry. And then, I feel we're sort of seeing more of that in the US come through as well, both in the maturity of data privacy laws, like, for example, what's going on in California. But then there are, I think it's the FTC in the US are also kind of looking at more privacy enhancing technologies. How can they be used? Again, it feels like that fin crime and anti-money laundering use case is the one that kind of is the big carrot for them. And so I suppose for me, it's more about, I think there's still a way to go in terms of the advocacy, right? So, and I think, and it's a complicated thing to answer because I think it comes from a combination of factors. It comes from more and more, geographies around the world are coming under more intense privacy legislation. So you've got a greater drive from consumers, but also regulators to put more privacy law in there to actually then be more, which is more restrictive for private sector on what they can and can't do with that data, right? And what's expected of them, frankly. You've also got a growing awareness, from sort of tech vendors in the space around what the opportunities are. Those sort of earlier use cases are a real thing that kind of help to be the tide that lifts all ships, right? So you can point to those proof points. And then you've got those pockets of regulators investing in the space internationally that then can be pointed to as use cases again to have that kind of groundswell, so to speak. And I think, frankly, the likes of the Privacy Enhancing Technology Summit, bringing a lot of these people together also helps to kind of generate that awareness and bring together the people who know and who are subject matter experts in the domain versus those who have industry problems, such that there can be kind of that gelling of these are those killer use cases. And frankly, I think it's got to be quite a few things that need to come together before this becomes mass market, right? But I do think from being in the space for the last few years, we are at a point now where it's very close to sort of a breakout, if that makes sense, right? Specifically, I'd say MPC probably is ahead of HE in terms of that in a breakout. But whether it's just even the general awareness of privacy enhancing technologies, I think is growing.
Yeah, I think I was kind of shocked that the NBC Alliance, I guess when I first started exploring homomorphic encryption, um, more heavily, I guess in 2019, the NPC Alliance was, you had it wasn't the same composition that it was today. It was hardcore research organizations. It was like Duality. It was like Inveil. I think it was Infer. There's a bunch of others, but there were a handful. And then I looked at the most recent list of NPC Alliance members, and it's like this whole ZKP digital asset crowd just like descended on.
Yeah.
It's like I think it makes up like half the membership, and that certainly helps because when you have that kind of interest flowing into it, it's certainly a rising tide lifts all boats. Sticking with the Privacy Enhancing Technology Summit, because I'm glad you brought that up. So you've been very involved in, I guess, the Privacy Enhancing Technology Summits that have been in Europe. And then there's also the Privacy Enhancing Technology Summit that's going to be hitting the U.S., the first one in Boston.
Yep.
May 18th, 19th. So that's how Alistair and myself were introduced through the crew that's doing that. That's a Privacy Enhancing Technology Summit. We'll drop it in the show notes. Check it out. Be bringing together a lot of experts, some from the down under as well, to talk about privacy enhancing technologies.
There are a few. I look at it, and I think, and as I sort of mentioned before, that I really do think that the team have done a great job in sort of helping to bring together people who are world experts, but also those who are looking to explore the space more. And I think it really does help to kind of lift to be that tide that lifts all ships and kind of bring people together.
Yeah. And it's interesting you talk about like different countries and regions who have sort of approached privacy enhancing technologies, and again, particularly around money laundering risks. You've seen the FCA do their technology sprints. You've seen the New York Department, NYSDFS, New York State Department of Financial Services. They did a number of tech sprints, including with like Infer, who I think you, Vanteum, partnered with, I think on certain proposals in Australia. Right. And so, I remember stumbling upon all these tech sprints that were lined up at NYSDFS, and it was really quite something. Like basically breaking up like individuals working across companies to just, and maybe working on more than one tech sprints, but each segmented from one another to sort of devise these sort of straw man solutions from which some of them have actually gone on to actually build some businesses around. So those tech sprints can be, I think it advances the whole privacy enhancing technology solution set so much more when they're engaging in that way. And then they're getting real-time feedback from the regulators. And even sometimes the regulators are part of the team helping to create it, which I just think is, awesome. Maybe rotating a little bit to open banking, near and dear to your heart. What is open banking?
Yeah, sure thing. So open banking, and it depends on the jurisdiction, but it can either be regulator-driven or market-driven. But it essentially allows consumers to get access to the data that a bank or another financial institution holds on them, such that they can then give that to a third party, which could be another bank or another sort of to a fintech. And really, how that's come about is that in the EU it started off as a Payment Services Directive 2. Which was really predominantly around payments and helping people to get rid of merchant fees and do account-to-account payments. Then the UK's implementation of that was really more about current accounts and driving more competition actually into the 9 largest banks in the UK, the CMA 9, they're otherwise called. And then in various other jurisdictions, it's predominantly been about competition and consumer choice and kind of innovation in the economy. Certainly in Australia, open banking and the thing called the consumer data right here are kind of used interchangeably. But really, what it is here is the consumer data right is aimed to be an economy-wide data right that allows consumers to be able to take the data from someone who's holding it on them, to be able to provide that to somebody else where they see there's value in that kind of exchange. And it is intended to be, as I say, economy-wide. the banking part of financial services is the first vertical of that kind of consumer data right. So the term is used a little interchangeably. In Australia, open banking is kind of the first foray. So the banks, which then will expand out into energy, telco, and then other sort of financial services providers like insurance, for example. But I think the thing is important to call out is open banking, while it is happening in some of these jurisdictions, is actually it's a global phenomenon. So it's happening around the world. It's happening in Latin America. Mexico are quite sort of within LATAM. They're some of the most proactive, and they've sort of passed a law in 2018. But then in the US, it's been more sort of market driven, so to speak. So not having the kind of regulatory framework around it. That feels like it might be changing in the next little while. So that's kind of the background into what open banking is. But I think what might also just be worth calling out is, why does it matter to a consumer, right? Because I think within open banking, there's a real tendency to think about what it means to a financial institution, but that's not actually the reason why it's kind of been regulated in any jurisdiction whatsoever. It's actually about consumer choice, transparency, driving competition into markets, so driving competition specifically into financial services, and it's really about being able to give consumers the ability to get a better offer and to switch banks, and to overcome some of that inertia, really. And that's how it's kind of come about. And so propositions include everything from getting a better rate on a home loan, getting a better rate on a personal loan, a credit card, through to just various comparison apps, and being able to switch energy providers, switch sort of telco providers. But then you're also seeing other sort of propositions emerge where people can actually get a recommended rate on a home loan, but actually then be able to switch and get an approval on a home loan within seconds. And then all of the sort of customer onboarding is taken care of based on the data that's been shared. So you're seeing some really interesting propositions that come out. I'd also say that open banking is probably more the guardrails and framework for some of those data shares, right? So what you can share, what you can't share, what are the sort of rules around it?
Right. And it's interesting. So as a consumer in the US, and maybe, again, maybe my experience is limited, does the average consumer, do they actually experience like an open banking platform, or does it happen more on the back end? Like, is there?
Yeah. So how and it's a great pickup, actually. So how in the US and other markets where it's not regulated, how they typically experience it is, I'm trying to think of a kind of a specific use case, but say it's a bank or a non-bank lender offering a fantastic rate on a home loan or a mortgage. In order to get that rate or a personalized rate, they'll prompt for, hey, can you give us access to, the data from your current bank? We want access to how you're spending your money, your assets, your liabilities, your transactional data stuff. That is then done in the back end using someone like Yodlee or Plaid in the US, where that is using a thing called screen scraping. So a technology called screen scraping, and essentially just drives the screen, rather drives the browser, pulls the data out, then via API gets sent, and to the acquiring bank, so to speak. And so it's very seamless to a consumer. I mean, there's naturally, apart from the fact that it's clunky, and apart from the fact that it's it sometimes breaches the terms and conditions of the bank, for example, that you're coming and you're giving your username and password to somebody to kind of come and take the data from the screen. It's a really clunky kind of technical solution, and it does not have the right data privacy guardrails or InfoSec kind of guardrails around it, right? And it's kind of implemented in different ways, and some banks block it actively. Other banks are kind of they kind of let it go, and others are just kind of more in that watch way. They want to know exactly who's doing what, who's hitting, who's giving their credentials away. So it is seamless to a consumer by and large, but it's kind of happening in the background.
Right. And I think most people in the U.S. at least have probably experienced Plaid in some way, shape, or form, given a consent. And so, in an open banking system, you've noted some of the some of the problems that maybe aren't the best for privacy. What pet technologies map particularly well to open banking solutions?
Well, I think, yeah, and I think the other thing that's an interesting one is almost the framing of open banking. So that's the kind of regulator and market driven approach. But if you think about the pressure that's put on existing financial services companies, where open banking is either regulated or it's market driven, you've got consumers able to get that transparency and choice, and being able to bring that data to somebody else. And there's a real potential threat, a competitive threat to some of these organizations. The other side to it really is that for a long time, and this may be a controversial comment, for a long time, a lot of these large financial services companies haven't done very much or enough with the data they've been sitting on, right? So as part of that, there's an increasing desire to do more with that data. There's an increasing desire to deliver more personalized propositions to consumers. There's a desire to kind of work through data partnerships with other companies in adjacent markets to kind of offer that value and personalize. And so that's kind of the framing. And so to undertake that, those data shares, there's a real growing demand for the likes of HE, secure MPC. Secure MPC works really well, certainly when there's multilateral partnerships. And so, for example, if you can have a bank working with a loyalty company to not only drive greater cross sell for, especially if it's a loyalty company attached to an airline, is actually being able to drive greater cross sell of credit cards that have loyalty points attached to them. But what are those personalized offers that we can then put to someone who is a frequent flyer, now that we can, given that the borders have opened? And then there's other propositions that are kind of that sit alongside open banking. So some of the data comes through an open banking regime, but what about the other data that we have that's not mandated to be shared? Can we set something up using homomorphic encryption where we can provide an insight to a fintech that's closer to us, such that they can provide a proposition, and almost that combination of closed ecosystem alongside that open ecosystem. And so there's growing, certainly in Australia, there are a number of banks here that are sort of investing heavily in secure MPC, hiring researchers in HE, and really looking almost to see what can be done in delivering some of these consumer propositions using the data that they have that sits outside of an open banking regime. So very, very symbiotic, I suppose, is the way that it's been looked at.
Yeah, and I guess there's sort of two ways of looking at it. One is to try to enhance the overall customer experience with more personalized services or offers, and then the other one is like thinking about almost marketing partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely.
For targeting.
Yeah, and it's not just in Australia. There's definitely banks in the UK which are sort of further along the journey in open banking that are investigating this space, and are using HE to even work with each other to kind of what are those things that we can do with consumers that are that can't be done through open banking. And by the way, that's also to sort of almost touch on another theme of how open banking is kind of has come about, is that open banking in almost every jurisdiction has come about because regulators have tried time and time again to get banks to be more competitive and to do more things, to make it easier for consumers to switch away. And it in almost every situation where banks haven't done that and got together, that's when the regulators have stepped in and said, well, okay, so here's a regulatory regime to kind of force this. So I'm certainly seeing some of those lessons being learned, and actually, banks and other financial services companies kind of going, well, how do we now use these technologies to work together? Because we now certainly see the North Star of where this all sort of heads, which is towards, greater openness, transparency, data almost being a proxy for money, right? In these sorts of setups too.
Yeah, and certainly like data portability turning into an opportunity. That's certainly, we're just at the beginning of that, right?
Oh, 100%, 100%.
And do you think like data portability is an opportunity that the obvious use case is open banking, or do you see other opportunities that may be tangential or related that might be equally compelling or more compelling?
Well, I mean, the other way to look at it is data portability and sharing data. We've been, as consumers, we've been doing it for a long time, right? So we've been doing it, with the likes of Facebook and others for a very long time. Now, this is more about the kind of the guardrails that have been put around it to kind of make it safe. And, for example, in Australia, you've got the right to delete. So you can go to the bank and say, look, you got my data through the consumer data right regime. I now want you to delete that data on me. And they have to. And so they're legally obliged, and they have to then, it's not as strong as GDPR, which is the right to forget. So forget you ever knew me kind of thing. I think so. So data portability has had a lot of opportunity for a long time. I just think it accelerates whenever there's a regulatory regime that makes it really, it actually makes it safe to share that data. And as a consumer, the safeguards are in place to be able to do that, right? But I think it also kind of within open banking almost needs to hit a tipping point where there's enough consumer propositions in markets. But to answer your question about some of the other areas and other areas where data sharing can deliver value, I really do think in some of those either public sector data shares or combinations of public-private sector data shares, there's an awful lot of untapped opportunity there where, before some of the impediments that I've certainly experienced and I mentioned earlier would have blocked either evidence-based policy decisions or things we just cannot detect patterns of fraud. There are now the opportunities to safely and without needing to move the data and without having to go and acquire all of that data and bring it to you, you can actually bring the algorithm to data where it currently resides. Naturally, healthcare is another area which has so much opportunity.
I know we talked a little bit about jurisdictions, and it's difficult. It's dependent on jurisdictions. But where do you see PETs being? Which jurisdictions do you think are most primed for the monetization of privacy-enhancing technologies, like the commercial use case, not so much the public one?
Certainly in Australia, our major banks, as I say, at least two of our major banks are actively looking at ways to not only spin up new propositions that are underpinned by privacy enhancing technologies, but also potentially new ventures in the space, right? So there's a real kind of appetite to see the opportunity for consented data share, consumer consented data share. I think jurisdictionally, the US would be pretty far ahead when it comes to some of the tech giants, right? So you've got Facebook very, very active, or Meta now, sorry, very, very actively hiring in the space in secure MPC and actually also in HE as well. And looking at their kind of private lift measurement pieces for their ads, right, is kind of underpinned by a lot of sort of MPC technologies. You got Amazon and through their Alexa fund looking at investigation of MPC for kind of privacy preserving analysis over voice, right? And they've made recent investments, right, like with the likes of Infer. And I'd also say that you look at what the likes of Microsoft have been very active in the space of HE, but also MPC for quite some time. IBM, Intel. I really think the US will be the first market where a lot of this stuff, in fact, it's already there, right? It's already behind the scenes, not necessarily being lauded as an MPC solution or an HE solution. It's kind of embedded, right? It's fully embedded. I'd also say that in the intelligence community, it would be North America generally that would be well ahead with the use of some of these technologies in intelligence settings as well. Yes, some in Australia, yes, the UK and the rest of Europe, but definitely the US that probably be leading the way there. And so I suppose if I was forced to say one geography or one jurisdiction where I thought would lead the way, it would be the US.
But what about just working across competitors, working horizontally, so where you have potential competitors sharing information, like for research, and then just leveraging their individual data pools, potentially presumably with secure multi-party computation, not HE. And then, benefiting that way. Have you worked with those kinds of initiatives and seen how they develop?
Yeah, so certainly the one that jumps out is around insurance sort of being able to identify potential insurance and fraudulent claims between insurers, certainly here in Australia, and I know it's happened elsewhere around the world. Unfortunately, this one didn't get off the ground, but it was one where it got quite well into kind of quite well into the execution, and it was really about, well, how do we identify those people who have multiple car insurance policies across different insurers who traditionally don't share data with each other for a bunch of reasons. One's competitive, the other one's actually it's a regulatory, there's a set of regulatory challenges. Is how do we then, if that person goes and crashes the car, makes a claim against two insurers, how do we make sure in this double dip scenario that's actually we know about that and that it's fraudulent, so that we don't actually pay out twice? And so really getting those insurers together to kind of agree the framework, look at some of the technologies to be able to apply. This was using some of the privacy preserving technology, so specifically some HE, but it was actually more kind of using a blockchain solution actually. And this falls down not because of the strength and merits of the technology, but more the sheer difficulties in orchestrating 4 to 5 large organizations to all agree and all come together and all to trust one another enough and all to execute together. So that's how that falls down, which, by the way, is probably one of the challenges that I see about multi-party computation adoption specifically, is that if you need multiple participants to generate value, it's actually how do you get those multiple participants together to actually not only agree on the solution, but to participate together. And then I think the other challenge as well is from a pure sales perspective, how do you have to go off and sell to each one of those participants to kind of get that to actually happen? And I think actually you probably heard Kevin McCarthy from Infer say something relatively similar in the past. But I think, yeah, so I don't see that as specifically a technology challenge as more as it is a kind of a getting multiple participants together to kind of execute together.
It seems like going into 22, we're seeing more privacy enhancing technologies find their way into digital assets, right? Like I mentioned about the MPC Alliance. It also kind of feels like it's possibly attracting more venture dollars. What are you seeing in Australia? Is it driving more venture investment? Is it escalating, leveling off, still yet to grow?
So definitely to grow. The privacy enhancing technologies, certainly in Australia, I'd say from a venture perspective, are far earlier on that kind of awareness curve / the actively investing side of things. I think globally, the likes of the West Coast US, East Coast US funds, they're far more active in the space, and I'm certainly seeing a greater appetite in investment for investment there. I'm also seeing in Europe, frankly, you've got the likes of Enterprise Ireland, which is the export arm of the Irish government, and a pretty active sort of seed investor. They've invested recently into separate homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party computation startups. You naturally have the big tech companies investing directly in this space, but also then through through them being LPs in various different funds. And obviously you've got the likes of Team 8 in Israel investing heavily in the space. Australia, I haven't felt that the awareness of the technologies is where I think it needs to be. I also think I'm seeing more appetite maybe from the corporate venturing arms here of companies, predominantly the sort of financial services side. But I do think, to your question, I really feel that 22 is a kind of a potential breakthrough year, and there is a lot more money flowing into it globally. And in fact, some of the startups that I speak to, sort of raising Series A and Series B, they're not having any challenges whatsoever getting a lead, or indeed, feeling like they're gonna fill the ramp. Right? It's becoming more and more on people's radars, and it's kind of the money's flowing behind that.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. You take care.